Good afternoon, and welcome to our talk today. This presentation is presented by the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship and the Frontier Center for Public Policy. And I'm just going to turn over to Paul for introducing our speakers.
Thanks, Robert. Can everybody hear me? Just raise your hand if everything's okay. Good enough. Anyhow, my name is Paul Viminitz. I'm a philosophy professor at the University of Lethbridge, and I've been asked to moderate this particular panel. So the way we're going to proceed here is I've suggested to the three panelists that they take somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes each and try not to go any further than that. But we're going to start off with Francis Whittison. Francis is made infamous by Francis, is it 2014, the publication of, no, it's earlier than that, of
2008.
2008, Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, which really didn't become terribly controversial until far more recently. But in the present climate, of course, it's been dredged up again, and it's now become quite problematic. Then followed that, we're going to have Brian Geesberg. Brian Geesberg is a retired provincial court judge from Manitoba, and he's now involved in his retirement with the Frontier Institute. Has a particularly keen interest and expertise in the area of Indigenous policy. And finally, Rod Clifford, if we ever get him actually visually online. He's also, he's emeritus from the University of Manitoba. He's an anthropologist. He is the one and only human being in the entire world who has actually read entire 400 pages. Every single word. What did I say? Sorry, 4,000 pages, excuse me, of the TRC report. And I think he's probably going to be telling us something about that. So we'll start off with Francis. So Francis, if you want to take it away.
Sure. So thank you very much, Paul. I'm a professor at Mount Royal University, and I'm a political economist. That's my area. So unlike Rod and Brian, who have much more expertise in the area of the residential schools, my interest in the residential schools was due to from a theoretical standpoint of a theory that I've developed with respect to Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations, which I'll talk about a little bit. So that's what I'm not really trying to go into depth about the Truth and Reconciliation report. And in fact, the title of this panel is, "Can we discuss those unmarked graves?" And I'm hoping that we're going to get into that quite a bit, because really Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship doesn't take a position on the academic merits of any of these arguments. It really is interested because it's very difficult to discuss the residential schools and the unmarked graves. That's the key area for the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship is, why is it that it becomes so difficult to discuss a particular topic in an academic setting? In an academic setting, you should be able to discuss all ideas. There shouldn't be some ideas which are taboo and are forbidden zones. So, and my theoretical approach will explain to some extent why it is so difficult to discuss the unmarked graves in an academic setting. So the question is, can we discuss those unmarked graves? Well, you certainly can. We're discussing them right now. So obviously discussion is still possible, but it's very difficult at your peril, as I say on this slide, because, and on the right-hand side of my screen anyway, you can see a little bit of what happens if you try to discuss the unmarked graves. And these are just two responses from academics to the Dorchester Review's posting of this panel. And we have a historian from the University of Manitoba, using words like residential school denialists. And then we have, and he's a historian, and then Daniel Heath Justice, who's a professor at the University of British Columbia, I believe he's literature. I'm not exactly sure, but anyway, you know, he's making all sorts of ad hominem comments and genocide denialism and all these sorts of kinds of ad hominem remarks make it, you know, if you don't want to put up with those kinds of attacks, generally you'll stay out of it and won't go into this area of research. Now, I've been, Albert Howard and I have been doing research on Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations for 25 years and are very used to this. So we're prepared to go forward and make these arguments, but most people are not. So it's very, very difficult. And what I wanted to talk to you just briefly today is, you know, how it came to be that it's so difficult to discuss issues such as these. And it's not just, you know, the unmarked graves and residential schools. There's a whole huge number of topics which are off limits in the academy today. And this is something I'm going to get into, and one of the main reasons is that the university has been taken over by what Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay call reified postmodernism, and I'll talk about that shortly. And then in terms of why this is happening with respect to the unmarked graves in particular, pertains to Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations, and this is the theoretical kinds of developments that I've gotten into, which is what I call neo-tribal rancherism, which I'll also explain very briefly. And just so that you know, these are all taken from 3 books which are currently in publication right now. Cynical Theories, which is excellent, about the reified postmodernism, Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, which Paul mentioned, and Separate but Unequal. Separate but Unequal in particular talks about neo-tribal rancherism. And then I'm currently working on a manuscript called The Woke Academy, which looks at reified postmodernism's effect on all areas of the university. So I'm really working on trying to understand that particular development that has happened in universities. So in terms of reified postmodernism, this is something which has happened to the academy. It's been slowly happening, but it's really ramped up since about 2015. That's when I really noticed that it was becoming very, very pronounced. And this development is discussed in detail by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay in their book, Cynical Theories. And they outline like the historical development of this, which started off as postmodernism, what they call deconstructive postmodernism in the 60s, which is a relativist philosophy, which then basically disarmed the academy. So the academy no longer had scholarship and science as constraining methods, which allowed identity politics to assert itself within the academy. But it was identity politics was accepted as one kind of perspective among many. What the really terrible thing that's happened in the academy now is that identity politics has become reified. This is the final stage, which is a totalitarian development. So what's happened is that you must accept the claims of identity politics. That's reified postmodernism. And they describe it as identities must be made real. So you must accept that the identity of a group claiming to be oppressed is actually real. And you know, people who are familiar with what's called wokeism. Wokeism is the colloquial description for reified postmodernism. Transactivism is a very good example of this. If you are born with XY chromosomes and you say that you are a woman, we must accept that that person is a woman, because that makes their identity real. It's their identity. It's not the reality of the XY chromosomes. It is that they think that they're a woman. That's what must be made real. And if you don't accept that, you will suffer consequences in the academy, because you will be claimed that you are aiding the oppression, you are supporting the oppression of this group if you don't accept their view of themselves. With respect to the unmarked graves, the identity that must be made real is the IRS, Indigenous Residential School, or Indian Residential School genocide survivor identity. So that must be accepted. The idea of being a survivor of genocide must be made real. And if you don't accept that, you will suffer consequences from that. And we are seeing that now, and I'll get to that shortly. It is being claimed now, and I never heard this before, a year ago, you wouldn't hear this. Now it is, if you deny the residential schools are genocidal, you are a genocide denier. And just like you would, suffer consequences if you're a Holocaust denier in the universities, right? Because you're denying an obvious historical fact, and therefore you're an incompetent. You should be fired for denying that genocide occurred with respect to the Indigenous population, and that the residential schools were genocidal. And you can see this in these slides, right? Pamela Palmater, it's no longer up for debate. Canada is guilty of genocide. And then Robert Yago's column, where he's saying that, the malign intent of the residential schools is a fact similar to gravity. Like that is astonishing that someone would say that gravity and the residential schools being genocidal is on somehow equivalent. And then we have Kisha Supernant, who's an archaeologist who's been involved in all sorts of, sort of totalitarian maneuvers. That's kind of how postmodernism allowed this to happen, because it attacked the goals of scholarship and science by saying that you shouldn't really have objectivity and detachment. So that kind of paved the way for postmodernism, reified postmodernists to come onto the scene, the attack on science that happened in the 1960s. So that's generally what's happened in the academy, and that's how the unmarked graves and the residential schools fits into it. Why is this happening? So that's kind of how it happened. Why is this happening? And it's from a political economy standpoint, the theory that I developed is the political economy of neo-tribal rancherism. And what does that mean? Neo-tribal is how Indigenous groups have been transformed through their incorporation into the capitalist system, but they're not workers and capitalists within the capitalist system. They take it on a rentier position, a position of rentierism, which is rent seeking. So rent seeking is when you have some kind of identifier that you're able to use to extract subsidies and transfers from off the system. So you don't increase productivity within the system like capitalist investment within the system. You just rake that off. That's rentierism, often through ownership positions, often ownership of land. And what happens is that you can increase the neo-tribes, these neo-tribal elements can increase the transfers through accusations of genocide. That is why that's why there is so much intent to get people to accept the genocide as being real, to make real the genocide is to increase the transfers. And what happens with these transfers, of course, is they're not circulated evenly amongst the population. You have an elite that's at the top of the neo-tribe, which gets the most of the benefits that come from these transfers that are extracted, and the negotiations of the agreements. Massive amounts are dispersed to what's called brokers, the ones that actually negotiate the neo-tribe's position. These are lawyers within the system. Residential schools, it was at least $100 million went to lawyers. Huge amounts of money are going to lawyers. And that's what you see here with these slides that I've posted, is that you see some of the neo-tribal elites arguing for money to be paid to the Survivors Society. You have lawyers who are going to start disputes about crimes against humanity. And we have child welfare programs that are going to be, money is going to be extracted for neo-tribes with respect to child welfare. And then we have the backdrop in the university, which is the academics, so the intelligentsia. You have academics and also journalists. And that's what is going on there at the bottom of the slide. Is we have, this is one of my colleagues, started off 3 colleagues, put forward a motion to General Faculty's Council to get the council to recognize the genocide that had been suffered by Indigenous peoples. And I objected to this, saying, what about dissenters? And my colleague said, of course you're allowed to dissent, but that doesn't stop us from having this vote to represent our values. And then just recently, about a month ago, this same colleague said, I support academic freedom, of course, but universities must absolutely fire racists who deny the real harm of the residential schools for Indigenous peoples, arguing that the residential schools somehow carried benefits. So if you say there's any benefits, he's arguing that you should be fired. And then, of course, the journalists, serious problems with the journalists. And that's a screenshot of Alana Smith, who recently did a hit job on me in the Calgary Herald. And it's sort of a typical kind of approach of journalists now, where they are very much part of this narrative. And it is very, very difficult, of course, if you're a journalist, to be critical of that. So that provides sort of support, intellectual support for all the neo-tribal rancherist processes that are going on. So that's basically what I'm doing in terms of my work, is I'm trying to develop a theoretical position as to why this claim of genocide has been so strong. And I'm trying to explain the reasons why we cannot discuss the unmarked graves, or it's difficult to, because it's a threat to that narrative of genocide. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I have to unmute myself. Thank you, Francis. I'm going to move on to Brian next. Brian, are you there and ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, I have found myself sort of the subject of a sort of mini social media mobbings when I've touched upon certain parts of the Indigenous issue, when I argued that status cards had no place in a modern country. Another time was when I said that the income tax exemption for basically middle and upper middle class people should be, there's no justification for having such a thing. And also when I talked about other aspects of residential schools, but I've never seen anything quite like this Kamloops graves issue. I think the discussion has been becoming more extreme, and this is sort of the plutonium end of that discussion, if I can put it that way, because it's almost unhinged. What I thought I would do is and Rod will be talking more about the details about cemeteries and that sort of thing, but what I decided I would spend my few minutes talking about is sort of my personal involvement in these issues and the burial sites, which is very little, but I have a few things to say, and then if I can talk about the residential school, the larger residential school a little bit. And I promise not to bog you down with facts and figures and that sort of thing. I live close to Brandon, Manitoba, and we've known about this burial site issue for a long time. There is an industrial residential school was located outside of Brandon for many years. And it was long known that there were burial sites. There was a cemetery where children from the school who had died at the school were buried. And there are some people, one man in particular, who's been working on this issue for years. He's an Indigenous man, and he really devoted his whole life to looking at this issue because it involves family connections and everything. And it's from that angle, it's perfectly understandable. He's a person who wants to know where his ancestors were buried, and there are a lot of very complicated feelings about residential schools. So it's very understandable that people like this, and I think this is happening all over the country, want to find out about these burial sites. They want to know more, and they want to be able to properly honor their children. And I think that's every one of us would support that. But what I find strange about this discussion is all of this was known to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I thought to all Canadians. And I'm still astounded that this was reported as some sort of shocking discovery that that should scandalize the nation. I remember listening to Commissioner Murray Sinclair even before the TRC report came out. I don't know exactly what year it was, but basically, he told us pretty well exactly what was going to happen. He said that there were something like 3,200 documented deaths at a residential school, but there were about that many again. I think he estimated the total number is 6,000 deaths. He said that many more people will be found if the government cooperates in granting enough money so that these searches can be made. And that's exactly what happened. I listened to him a few times. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission hired Dr. Scott Hamilton to do a very comprehensive report about burial sites, and that report has been available for many years now, at least since 2015. Any Canadian can download that report free and read it, and there are other summaries of that report available. And he not only said, Hamilton not only said that these burial sites would be found, he pointed specifically to some sites. For instance, he pointed specifically to the Kamloops residential school and said that when they did searches, they would find burial sites there, and that's exactly what's happened. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in their calls to action, recommended that the government commit funds for the purpose of doing these investigations, and I believe that a total of something like $33 million was granted by the government. And now the provincial governments have also contributed. So I think, and I don't have the exact figures, but I think there's about $50 million that is available for doing these searches. And that's exactly what is happening. Some of that money has been spent, and some of it has now found these burial sites at Kamloops. What astounds me is that neither the political leaders or the media seem to be aware of any of this. And the political leaders reacted very emotionally to the news of this Kamloops discovery. It seems to me that real leadership would have, their aides would have at least told them about this, and then they could sort of caution the public that no, these are not mass murders. This is not a mass grave situation. These are children that died, sadly, very sadly, but they died of basically infectious diseases. And Hamilton's report even goes in fairly in a fair amount of detail and discusses the various diseases that these children died of. I just dug up one statistic to sort of illustrate how much more common death was in those times. And this would be around 1890, where something like 1 in 3 children died before their 5th birthday. And the infant mortality rate was something like almost as high, almost 30%. Now, among Indigenous people, it was even higher. And for some diseases, Indigenous children unfortunately died in great numbers in their home communities and also at residential schools. Influenza, for instance, was a terrible killer. For other children, it was an illness, except for the 1918 one, which of course was a strain that actually killed younger people as well. but Indigenous children regularly died in alarming numbers from influenza. So death in that time, the death of a child, was not an unusual thing. As a matter of fact, I think it's true that a family felt very fortunate if all of their children actually survived until their adult years. And that seems to be lost. We don't. I've read all of the accounts from some of our journalists that I respect, and I saw none of that in their reports. I saw a lot of indignation and just going along with the mass grave type of thing. And I regard this this incident, maybe I'm not seeing it accurately, but I regard the whole fevered discussion about the Kamloops graves as a huge failure of both our media and our political leadership. I think Canadians have been misled, because if you talk to the average Canadian, they think some horrible event must have occurred at these schools, when all of the evidence points to the sad death of children. Some of them were far away from their homes. Some of them may have been very close to their homes. In some cases, the parents may have wanted the children buried at that particular cemetery. In some cases, it will be a common cemetery where community members, as well as as the kids from the residential schools were buried. But this was just a normal, sad part of life. And I think one of the dimensions that we miss is that middle class, rich, or the wealthier class people have a certain type of cemetery. I mean, you have a cemetery where you have a headstone, and somebody is keeping up your grave. If you live in a city, you probably bought some sort of a plot contract where the company looks after the tends the graves. If you live in a rural area, that may depend, as I do, may depend on voluntary labor. It may have the families looking after the grave sites. In many cases, the poorer people did not have that. And I think that some of these were actually like paupers' graves. I referred to the Brandon situation, for instance, where you had kids from the residential school being buried in that cemetery, but they also believe that people from the Brandon Mental Health Center, the mental hospital I was here for many years, were also buried at that site. And I expect that they're going to find that across the country, that these are untended cemeteries, in many cases used by many different people. But the common element would be, these would be the poorer people, the pauper's grave, if you like. And really, the poorer person would be buried with usually a cross, sometimes a painted cross, sometimes it would not even be painted. And unless those sites were maintained and they would deteriorate. My understanding is that in many Indigenous communities, the tending of cemeteries is not culturally something that is particularly important. So I would guess that we're going to find that there are untended cemeteries, throughout Canada. It's nothing that is unusual at all. So I'm not trying to excuse any negligence or anything like that. I think there's a lot of fault to find, for instance, with the residential schools and their very cheap policy. The federal government's very cheap policy of not wanting to pay any more money for a burial than or for transportation back home to the community than what a burial would cost. And I think the federal government in particular is probably going to deserve some well-founded criticism. What I find myself personally disturbed about is the slander. And I think that's a proper word. The way these nuns, in particular, and these were made, the Catholic schools were made mainly nun-run schools. The nuns would teach the children. In some cases, an order of nuns would dedicate their lives towards teaching these Indigenous children. And now to have their names, to be called these names and watch their churches burn, I think it's really something that the nation should be, we as a nation should be ashamed of. I believe that. Now, I could, if you want me to, Paul, I'm going to let you tell me if I should do this or not. Talk a little bit about my own sort of acquaintance with residential schools and how that developed, or would you rather me just leave that until question time?
I'd rather you leave that till question period, but I want to ask you to include, before you conclude, before we move on to Rod, I would like you to say a few words, if you would, about the exhumation problem. So that, first of all, we're looking at, by the time we're done, we're looking at least 3,200 grave sites. The cost of exhuming those graves would be astronomical, but not just that, there would be legal questions and ethical questions about the exhumation, especially if you're doing it on the basis of speculation. As a retired judge, I'd like you to say a few words, if you don't mind, even for just a minute, about how problematic that would be, or maybe you think it's not problematic at all.
No, I think it would be, and I don't claim any real expertise in the exhumation law. I didn't do any of it, so I know very little about it. But I don't think it's ever going to get to that stage. My guess is that they're not going to be digging up bodies. The previous times when Indigenous communities were involved and the question came up about digging up bodies, culturally, I don't think it's appropriate. I think they find it quite offensive generally. And also, just imagine the legal issues involved here. If you had a cemetery that might include the Catholic Church, it might include community members, it might include people from the mental hospital, or indigent people from the hospitals, or whoever was buried in these cemeteries. And as I say, these, by and large, some of them will be paupers' graves. I think the legal problems would be so huge that I would be very surprised if we see any bodies being dug up. I think we're going to see more of these radar sites, and hopefully we'll get some decent discussion about all of this thing. I hope we don't just continue to react like this frenzied reaction whenever we hear about another discussion. I worry, and Francis has touched on this, although there are very legitimate reasons why many people, many Indigenous people want answers about this, and I respect those completely. The people who are after the money, who are exploiting this issue, I worry that they're going to try for as much sensationalism as possible. And I think we have to try to introduce a little, we have to start an intelligent discussion about this before things get out of hand, because this is hurting the country a great deal. It's not only internationally. This is really a terrible moment for the country. But in short answer to your question, I doubt that we're going to see bodies dug up.
And I did a very brief review of the literature, and apparently it would cost about $70,000 per exhumation. Right? I mean, if you multiply that, that's an awful lot of money. But the other thing is that the radar isn't going to tell you who's down there, nor is it going to tell you from what did they die, right?
No.
So, I mean, without exhumation, it's, and as you say, I mean, that would be completely, not just economically impossible, but probably ethically problematic at the very least, right? So I do want to come back to what you were saying about the
Sure.
experience in this, but I do want to move on to Rod. We'll come back afterwards in the question period. I'd like to hear from Rod next, if you don't mind. Thank you, Brian.
Yep.
Rod?
Now, I think I'm on now.
You're on, but we don't see you, but that's okay.
Yeah, I can't get it fixed up. And I want to say a few things, and very short. I agree basically with Francis and Brian's perspective. I'm a sociologist who has both lived in a residential school, worked in another one, Stringer Hall in Inuvik for a year, and studied them and published my first article in the Canadian Review of Sociology and Anthropology when I was beginning graduate student in 1972. So I've been involved in this a lot longer than some of the people that are making a lot of fuss about the issue. So I want to continue with one of the points that Brian made, and that is the fact that Canadians need to know. Burying people in cemeteries with headstones is a very recent addition to the Indigenous cultures of Canada. I know the Blackfoot, the Siksika best, who have their nation about 100 kilometers east of Calgary. I worked as an intern on the Siksika Reserve during the summer of 1966. And in 1968, I married a woman from there, Elaine, a young man. So we've been married for 53 years, and I've paid particular attention to what's going on in all of these issues because I study Aboriginal issues as well. Traditionally, the Siksika put their dead on platforms in bluffs of trees along rivers, along streams, or around sloughs. When I was an intern in 1966, an old man took me to see one of these sites. It was in the bushes along the Bow River on the road to Arrowwood from Gleason. This site is unmarked, not remembered, and unknown. Nobody remembers where it is. Indigenous people have lived in this country for over 14,000 years. Thus, there are millions of sites like the one that I observed with unmarked graves scattered across the country. It seems obvious that the practice of creating cemeteries, burying bodies in the ground, and marking graves with headstones was adapted from the Christians. So it became part of the Aboriginal culture as a result of the Christian missionaries coming there. It is not an old Siksika tradition. Rather, it is a new tradition. Second fact, if you go to the Anglican cemetery on the Siksika Reserve, it's called Canonstocken Cemetery, you will see that between 80 and 90% of the graves are unmarked. Between 80 and 90% of the graves are unmarked. Many have, in fact, returned to native prairies with grasses growing over them, with gopher holes into them. And I've seen similar cemeteries at the Roman Catholic cemetery down by Crowfoot School. And I've seen them on other reserves as well that are like that. The Blood Reserve has cemeteries and they're basically like this. Most of the graves are not unmarked, and many of them are returning to native prairie. Now, these graves were generally marked, and the funerals that I've gone to, the people and the churches will put up small white crosses, generally, as Brian indicated, with the name of the person and the date that they died and the date that they were born. But over time, these crosses deteriorate and they are lost, and the grave becomes unmarked and unremembered. My wife and I went to find her brothers. She's got 3 brothers that are in the cemetery, and we couldn't find the graves after 4 or 5 years because we didn't remember where they were exactly, and the markers had all disappeared. So I think this picks up on Brian's point that Aboriginal people are not as conscientious about marking graves as other people are, and maintaining cemeteries in a way that other people maintain cemeteries. So it's very confusing to me when I hear points about marked graves and the fact that the marked graves indicate that people had been murdered and disposed of the body in such a way that it couldn't be recovered. I think there's another hypothesis that one could make for this. Let me try that hypothesis, and it's got 4 points to it. First, the sites that have been identified And if you look at the photographs of them, are cemeteries that were associated with the parish church, which were in many cases the chapel in the residential school. So the church and the chapel were identical. That was true at Crowfoot School, on the Blackfoot Reserve. It was true at St. Paul's on the Blood Reserve. It's true at Old Sun on the Blackfoot Reserve. The church and the chapel were identical, and the church was for the parishioners and for the students. So during the week, the students would have their chapel services in there, and on Sunday, the parishioners would come and have their church services in the church. Along with that, of course, was a cemetery. And often these cemeteries were either close to the school grounds or actually in the school grounds, as they are in the Kamloops, the Kamloops school. The second point is that the cemeteries were properly consecrated by both the Christians and the Indigenous people. I think that's probably true, though I haven't seen any evidence of it. But I think it's probably true, knowing how much respect many of the Christians had for the Aboriginal people. And if you think about the Blackfoot, the first orthography and dictionary that was written by the first principal of Old Sun School. So this is not a person that didn't like the Blackfoot. He actually loved the Blackfoot and created a dictionary and orthography for their language that has only been superseded by a more recent one in the last 25 years. Third point is both adults and children and Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are often buried in these cemeteries. Cannon-Stockan Cemetery, for example, on the Blackfoot Reserve, Cannon-Stockan is actually buried there, and they planted a tree, and it's a great big tree in the middle of the cemetery, and the cemetery is expanded around his burial site. Fourth, where existing records exist, they will show, I think, that both Christian and Indigenous ceremonies were performed during the burial, as they were for my parents and brothers-in-law who were buried on the Blackfoot Reserve. They included both Christian as well as Blackfoot ceremonies. So in conclusion then, it seems to me that most journalists and academics do not know or have intentionally forgotten that Volume 4 of the TRC report discusses unmarked graves. In that volume, especially Chapter 3, the commissioners acknowledged that unmarked graves were going to be identified with further investigation. I don't know why we got into such a kerfuffle about this when it's so clear in the report, and why so many people jumped on the bandwagon to say that this was automatically a response to children being murdered. So I won't say that these graves have been discovered, or these cemeteries have been discovered, because most of them were not lost. And they were just forgotten at best. Some of them were actually known, and I think people were making a political statement by making claims that aren't actually true. So to echo what Brian said, to determine if children are buried in these graves, it is necessary to conduct proper research. Only with proper forensic analysis by well-qualified professionals will we get at the truth. It is time for people to stop speculating and reacting emotionally on what they think may have happened. It is time to wait for these analyses to come out. But I agree with Brian. I think it's too expensive that people will, and too legally complicated to actually do it. But if analyses are done, I hope that they're published in peer-reviewed technical reports and journal articles, and then we get a more assurance of what actually is being found. The sensational comments by journalists, academics, and some Indigenous people are not helping get to the truth. And I want to remind everybody something that they already know, that the TRC report claims that truth is a necessary prerequisite for reconciliation. And if we got this amount of disagreement on what constitutes the truth, I really think that we're going to have a long and hard slog to actually get to reconciliation, if we ever get to it. It's going to be a hammer held over the head of Canadians from now until the end of time. I'm afraid of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rod. Rod, just before I turn the conch over to Robert again, I do have one question for Francis. Francis, if you wouldn't mind turning your mic on and thank you. Francis, can you draw the line between these graves and the claim of genocide? And we're not talking about cultural genocide here.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I mean, could you maybe draw the inferential line, however sloppily it's been drawn, but help us understand how that works.
Yes. Well, the line is that in order for a genocide to have happened, you have mass graves. So like there's never been a genocide where there's been no mass graves, because that's where, and you know, Paul had an amusing letter or blog post where he's talking about I think it's Bobby Yar is the grave, is a ravine where the Nazis shot 30,000 people and threw them all in this ravine. So that would be like, and Bosnia and so on, and presumably Rwanda, you have a mass grave, and that's kind of evidence. A mass grave, not all mass graves are evidence of genocide, but in order for there to be a genocide, you're going to have mass graves.
You could have a plague, for example, and as a result of a plague, you could have a mass grave.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I think with the residential schools, there were a couple of times where there was an epidemic which killed a number of children or people, and they just buried them all together. That's not what happened at Kamloops or anything like that, but it's possible. So that wouldn't necessarily, but if you do have, so that's kind of the smoking gun for genocide, or at least indications of genocide. And so that's why, and I saw, I can't remember who I saw that had written it, but it was basically saying, how can you not have a genocide if there's a mass grave, or that sort of thing. So that's why the mass grave was being emphasized. And that's why it's all sort of seen as this, like it's this surprise. So obviously there was some attempt to hide things, you know, like there's all these kind of innuendo that are going on around that. So that's why, that's the linkage between the two things.
Okay, it's because of that slippage from unmarked graves to mass graves. And then from mass graves, you get to genocide. And that's the road it's going through.
Yes.
Okay. I do have one last question before, and that is to Rod. Rod, if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, so you say that you can't have that truth and reconciliation are linked in this particular way, and I'm wondering why. I mean, if what we're trying to do is to kind of reconcile, couldn't a lie be more likely to reconcile us than the truth in some cases?
I think Francis is better to answer this one, and that is there's no end to the expenses. If you look at the 94 calls to action and you compare them with the treaties, you will see that the treaties always have responsibilities that go both ways. There's expectations on both sides. We will build schools for you if you ask for them, but we won't build them unless you ask for them. So it's a reciprocal relationship. Whereas in the truth and reconciliation calls to action, every single one of them is unlimited, and it only goes in one way. It only goes in the rent-seeking way that Francis has identified, that non-Aboriginal people will be paying Aboriginal people. And there's no limit to it. So it says that there has to be adequate funding for the education, post-secondary education of Aboriginal students, right? So that means every person in an Aboriginal community could do a postdoc, right? All the way up to a postdoc, and it would be funded by the Canadian Society. But that's a problem. it's rent seeking at the best.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm asking a philosophical question, which is, you know, what's the relationship between social relations and truth? But we'll do that. We'll do that in a philosophical blog rather than here. I'm passing the conch over to Robert if you want to take over at this point, Robert.
Hello, thank you very much. There's been a lot of very interesting discussion in the chat if people have followed it. And so I hope I haven't missed questions, but I don't really have very many. So please send some if you haven't been already called on by me. But the first question we're going to do is from Rhoda, if she wanted to ask her question or comment, I guess.
Okay, folks, so I am a scholar of comparative genocide. I have taught courses on that, and I have taught them since the mid-'80s. So I am speaking with some level of expertise here. I'm not going to pass a judgment on the residential school death rate because I haven't seen the comparative figures. I have seen one letter to the Globe and Mail, which unfortunately I forgot to cut out, citing a study saying the death rates at the schools were 18.5 times the death rates in the population at large among children. But I would have to find the original study, and I haven't done that. Helen Fine is a very distinguished scholar of comparative genocides, and she published an article in 1993 called Genocide by Attrition. Now, she was not looking at residential schools. She was looking at places like Cambodia, and also the debate about, I believe, whether the Armenians suffered genocide. So genocide by attrition would be when large numbers of people in an identifiable group died from neglect, malnutrition, and disease, which was either encouraged or ignored. So as you know, in the Nazi concentration camps, many people died of disease and malnutrition before they actually got to the gas chambers. Now, in law, you would have to show that that is intent, right? The Genocide Convention refers to intent. It does talk in the Genocide Convention about deprivation of conditions that would allow the population to live. The Genocide Convention also talks about kidnapping of children. That was because of the children who were kidnapped from places like Poland and Scandinavia because they fit the Nazi definition of a beautiful blonde child and so on. So the data might show, I think, that there were significant degrees of neglect of Indigenous children. For example, if you had a child with TB in a dorm with 20 other kids and you didn't remove that child, you might consider that to be neglect. To show that it was genocide in law, you would have to show that it was intentional neglect as well. But I would not rule out the question of genocide unless we have a lot more information first. Thanks.
Well, can I respond?
Could I just ask?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Could I just ask that the speakers as well mute themselves unless you're actually talking? Thanks.
Sure, Brian Geesberg. I'm not an academic. The book that I still find very helpful on Indigenous people and disease is still Daschuk's Clearing the Plains. I think that's sort of recognized as a, he has a particular point of view, as every author has, but I think it's very good. But I think that some of the things that were done during the residential school time to deal with disease, the attempts to deal with particularly tuberculosis, which was a terrible disease for everybody, but for Indigenous people, it was awful. An example of what they did try to do, and I'm not being an apologist for the residential school but for instance, they would have the children in tents. They would have children living in tents even into the cold season in an attempt to deal with the problem of tuberculosis. And I've looked at some of the figures that are now being bandied about how high the death rate was in residential school compared to the communities, and they are terribly suspect at best. From, again, I'm thinking of Daschuk's book and talking about the, where he talks about the terrible epidemics that swept through the Indigenous community. Smallpox wiped out entire communities, etc. So I think that we have to be very careful when we're looking at some of the figures that are now being thrown about how high the death rate was in residential schools compared to the general community, because children were definitely dying at what rates we would today find alarming. And conservatively, the death rate in Indigenous communities was, as I understand it, at least twice as high. And for some diseases, it was even more. So I'll just leave it at that and let somebody else comment.
I'd like to comment, Paul. So thank you very much, Rhoda. I really appreciate your comments, because it adds some complexity to the discussion as well. I think we sort of need to ask, why do we want to define genocide, or why is it that genocide is a very important concept? So it's a question about conceptualization. So there's been many instances in history where you have situations like poorhouses and orphanages and all these kinds of institutions where vulnerable people are being looked after in an institutional setting, and often neglect is a problem, is a very huge problem in those institutions, because those people that are living in those institutions don't really have advocates who are looking after them, and they're sort of reliant on the goodwill of the institution and the people who are there. And often you can have malevolent individuals who are working there. And I'll just give one example. Oliver Sacks, who people are probably familiar with, his parents, he's a doctor and was a very interesting guy who I think he was responsible for Cocoon, the movie. He was kind of a polymathic kind of guy. Anyway, his parents sent him away when it was the war because they didn't want him. Anyway, they sent him to this school, this boarding school, where the headmaster was a sadist and was obviously deranged and used to beat children up, like beat Oliver Sacks up for no reason. And it was just, he was traumatized by it. Like he got over it, but he was, anyway, so that's the kind of environment that you can have in those institutions. So the question is, do we want to, in terms of conceptualization, include those kinds of circumstances into the definition of genocide? It seems to me to be getting off the main purpose of having the definition of genocide, which seems to me to be trying to get at a situation where a state wants to exterminate an ethnicity or a group and identify, and not politically either. That's often not. So if you want to get rid of communists or your political opponents or whatever, and you kill them, that's not seen as genocide either, because it's like a political dispute, not like you're singling out a particular racial group or an ethnicity for targeted extermination. So I'm just raising the question of conceptualization and the difficulties we're going to get into if we're going to draw the boundaries as broadly as people who are trying to say the residential schools are genocidal are.
I think I can add three points about this. First of all, part of my personal history, I had tuberculosis meningitis in the latter part of the 1940s, and it wasn't until 1947 that streptomycin, the first effective drug against tuberculosis, was in fact developed and was used. The sanatorium, sanatoria that I was in were not very pleasant places. And every 4 hours I got a poke in the backside. And I remember once a nurse saying to me when I was 3 years old, which side do you want it on today? And I said, well, we did it every 4 hours, so it was more than once a day. I said, I don't want it on either side today. And she gave it to me anyways with a smile. And that was the end of that discussion about that. The second point is the comparative figures are not published in the TRC Commission report, and I think Brian and Francis will echo this. There are no comparisons in that report in terms of the death rates on reserves, the death rates of children who went to day schools, or the death rate of children who didn't go to schools. So what we know about the history of these people is that about a third of the children, only about a third of the children over the 113 years went to residential school. The other 70% went to either day schools or didn't go to schools at all. Were kids kidnapped? So one of the points that was made was that the kids were kidnapped. Well, this is, at least in the latter part, pretty difficult to understand. I worked in Nunavik, and the kids were coming in from about 1,000 miles to the east along the coast and along the Mackenzie River Valley. The Anglicans evangelized the Inuit, and the Catholics evangelized the Dene along the Mackenzie River. I got a list of all the kids that were supposed to be in the dorms that I was responsible for. So I was responsible for 3 dorms with 85 children in it, 22 hours a day, 6 days a week, okay? There were some children that were on my list that never came. So I asked the administrator, the principal of the school, Reverend Holman, why are these kids? Where are these kids? And his response was, their parents kept them at home because they were needed for the trapping and hunting. So if a family had a new baby, then maybe the oldest daughter would stay home and help with that. And if the family was doing more trapping or hunting, then one of the older boys would stay home. The second point that relates to this is people don't seem to realize that in many of the southern schools, kids, if they had good homes, went home on the weekend. That seems to be, it's not mentioned in the TRC Commission report. It assumes in the report that the kids are in the schools for 10 months of the year and then perhaps go home at the summer holidays, rather than what was normally the case on the Blackfoot Reserve, on the Blood Reserve, on the Pagan Reserve, on many of the reserves in Saskatchewan, is that kids that were in good homes would go home on Friday. Their parents would come and pick them up, and they would come back to school on Sunday morning because their parents were going to go to church, and they were going to go to church with their parents. And then sometimes they would leave and go for lunch at their grandparents' place and then come back to the school so that they would be registered in at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the evening in time for dinner. So, like, if kids can come and go, they're not kidnapped. And so I think we have to be a little bit careful about saying that kids were actually kidnapped. I worked, part of my job when I was interning on the Blackfoot Reserve was to be a truant officer. And sometimes I was sent out to kids' home to pick up kids and bring them to school. I would stop at a crossroads in the middle of the prairie, right? The kids would jump out of the car, the boys, the girls would never do this. They would jump out of the car and start running across the prairie. I would have to stop the car, park it, and then take after these kids and catch them. As soon as I caught them, I just grabbed them by the scruff of the neck. I didn't hurt them and lead them back to the car and say, you got to go to school. That's, I guess it was kidnapping. But if they wanted to, they could certainly get away because I went to their homes. They could have just gone out on the prairies and I would have never found them. And the kids in the north, if the parents didn't want the kids to go to school, they would just go out on the trap line or out on the barrens, and nobody would find them. Even if you had planes, you couldn't find these kids. you couldn't find the parents. So it's pretty hard to believe that kids were actually kidnapped and forced to be in residential school, at least at the latter part of the school. In Old Sun, where when I was working there as an intern, when the kids went home for the weekend, the parents were bringing them back on Sunday, and they were going to church and then saying goodbye to their children and leaving. Like, why would they do that if they didn't agree with what was going on in the school? So the 3 points that relate to the issue about the genocide and about the kidnapping of children and forcing them to attend and participate in the schools. More questions?
Yeah. Rob, am I next?
Yes, sorry, Boris is going to be the next next person.
Okay, thanks. Paul, you raised the question about the connection between truth and reconciliation, and then declined to pursue it further on the grounds that it might lead us down the path of philosophy, which for some reason you think isn't appropriate. And with all due respect, I beg to differ slightly. Let me just explain why. If we say there is a connection, I believe it's because we presuppose, one of the presuppositions we make is that there's a genuine willingness on the part of all involved to reach the truth. So if we don't think that that sort of connection could be made, would it be because at least some of the parties involved don't really want the truth? They want to present an opinion that they would like to bully the rest of us into thinking is the truth, but is in fact not the truth because it's not grounded in all of the relevant facts. And that may be the case here. From the things that you and Francis and Rod and Brian have been saying, it seems that there are at least certain leaders in the Indigenous Canadian community who are in fact interested in the truth, at least to some extent. Shouldn't we, in our arguments and rhetoric, whatever you want to call it, be calling out precisely those people who wish to shut down discussion of these issues on the grounds that they are more interested in politics than they are in the truth? And if that's the case, then really we should be pursuing that connection between truth and reconciliation. I'd like to hear your response to that. But also, Francis, you and Brian and Rod, what do you think? What should we be pushing for the truth here? Seems to me all of your arguments add up to that conclusion.
Let me answer first because I can answer briefly.
Yeah.
Some truths are counterproductive in terms of, so for example, let's suppose that one of you knows the day and the hour of my forthcoming passing.
Yeah.
You know exactly when. Don't tell me. Okay.
Yes.
My affairs are all in order. All right. All you're going to do is you're going to bum me out. All you're going to do is you're going to, like living with the Grim Reaper kind of, I mean, it's one of the reasons why they say, that capital punishment is cruel and unusual, is cruel and unusual punishment. Why? Because of this constant sense of, I'm about to be killed. This is why if you are going to have capital punishment or something like that, for God's sake, just one day when he's walking towards to having lunch, just shoot him in the back of the head with, as a surprise, right? So now I use that in my classroom as an example of the truth doesn't always set you free, right? Yeah. But I, and I mean, I could, of course, extend that example, right across the political landscape. More particularly with respect to the issues at hand, I mean, there is this myth of Indigenous exceptionalism, and this myth of Indigenous exceptionalism to call it out is probably doing more damage than good. For example, it wasn't the Europeans who brought slavery to the North American shores. There was slavery from coast to coast, was rampant all across North America. But this is not the kind of, it's not helpful to bring this out. It just doesn't do any good. So you've got this fight between the 1776ers, right, which is kind of the so-called right wing, and then the left wing, the Black Lives Matter want to say, no, American history starts in 1619. No, American history starts, 10,000 years BC. But we probably not very helpful, right, in the current political context. So all I'm saying is that sometimes, you should just shut up. Just zip it, right? But I want to hear what the other three have to say. But I know for a fact that Francis does not agree with me on this. She's shaking her head. Francis and I fought about this before, but go ahead, Francis.
Well, I think Paul's mixing up a bunch of different situations with, he's trying to confuse us with his sophistry.
Sleight of hand.
But anyway, I think if we want to have policy, develop policy, we have to base it on some kind of common understanding. Of course, truth is a difficult thing because we're working towards the truth. We're seeking the truth, but we can never really be sure that we have found it. The difficulty for all of this stuff, and this is wokeism, reified postmodernism, is it's relativist. So the relativist position, and actually, I believe the TRC, at least this was Nietzsche's, his book criticizing that, or somewhat of a critique of the TRC, pointed this out, that the truth is not a universal for the TRC and for the reified postmodernists. They say that it's relative, and in fact, this now has got turned with reified postmodernism into it's the truth that the oppressed say it is, and if you don't accept their truth, you are an oppressor. So this is kind of the problem. So I don't agree with Paul about this. Like if I thought that Paul was ugly, which of course I do not, then it wouldn't be helpful for me to tell him that, because that's just it. First of all, that's a subjective position anyway. But secondly, it doesn't matter one way or the other to policy or to trying to do things and so on.
I very much resent this example, but go ahead.
You asked for it.
I did.
But for things like we're trying to figure, and this is the big thing with Indigenous policy, the policy about Indigenous peoples is we've got terrible problems that exist in Indigenous communities, and this is the marginalized Indigenous communities, which have all these difficulties, and we're trying to figure out the way forward, which, quote unquote reconciliation, I guess, is what we're saying. If we misdiagnose the problem, we're never going to be able to address those serious issues. And all these allegations of genocide and so on, this is not helping us to understand the causes of Indigenous deprivation. So I think it's the thing about the relativism that is causing these problems, which was made possible in the 60s, which has now been taken over and then sort of turned on its head, where we're now being coerced, accept this truth, or you're a person who obviously hates Indigenous people, or you're all these kind of insults. So I think we really need to search for the truth before we can find improvements to Indigenous circumstances, would be my response.
Can I take a crack at that too, Paul?
Sure.
And I'll just, I'm just going to add, I agree with that completely. but I think we're just on almost as things are presently set up, we're almost on a hopeless road here. Reconciliation, who would not want that? I mean, that's wonderful. That's apple pie. Of course, we all want reconciliation, but what that from the TRC, what that means is we have to accept the notion that residential schools were really responsible for all the dysfunction within the Indigenous community. And I think that's going down a rabbit hole, because I don't think that's true at all. I wanted to talk a little bit, just for a minute, about what the old understanding of residential schools used to be, because I've been sort of on this file for a long time, and I used to talk with people quite frequently when I was doing my work about their experience in residential schools. And during the 70s and 80s, and even into the 90s, the discussion usually was, well, you know, it was real tough at residential school because we weren't used to the discipline and we were real lonely, but I sure am thankful that I got my education at residential school. And that was sort of the general tone. Now, I wouldn't have been told if there was sexual abuse or anything like that, but generally there was a recognition that residential schools had a mixed sort of a mixed record, but generally people who went to those schools felt kind of grateful for doing that. And there was no question, at least from my experience, that the educated class, the Indigenous educated class, received their education because they went to residential schools. They were the leaders. That Assiniboia School in Winnipeg is a good example I use, because they had a good hockey team, and 8 of the members of that hockey team went on to become chiefs in their community. So I think it's just evident that residential schools, yes, they harmed a lot of people, but they did some people a lot of good. But that discussion is no longer. Now we're into this, residential schools are just a house of horrors. The last Free Press, last time I read the Winnipeg Free Press, it said that residential schools were the final solution. In other words, equating it to Hitler exterminating all Indigenous people. And the other one I always remember is Romeo Saganash, who was a real residential school activist. And he, during the Lynn Bayak hearings, if you remember that, he talked about it as the Holocaust. And of course, all the good reporters in the room knew that Romeo Saganash, yes, he went to residential school, but his hockey team went to Europe, for instance, on an all expense paid trip twice. So I mean, you have this over-the-top discussion with no, the media didn't intervene, the politicians did not say what they should have said. So we're now in this space where we're supposed to accept the idea that residential school were just absolutely evil and genocide and whatever words they can come up with next. But it just isn't true. Residential schools weren't even particularly important to the Indigenous problems we have today. I mean, read Tom Flanagan's book, it'll tell you. We have the reserves, the dependency of reserves, we have the grievance victim mindset. We have all sorts of very serious problems, but we're asked to accept the idea that residential schools are the root of all evil, and what we do is have this never-ending reconciliation program, which just happens to cost billions of dollars a year, and that's somehow supposed to lead us out of it. It won't. All it will do is enrich certain people, but the underclass, the people that we really care about, are not moving at all. There's no social mobility in this for them. So I think we've got to get off this track. We've somehow got to move beyond the residential school discussion so we can get to the real problems that are preventing Aboriginal people from making the progress that they're entitled to.
Paul, could I add just a few very quickly, 2 points. First of all, my wife went to Old Sun Residential School for 10 years. And when we first got married in the 1960s and the 1970s, people would say, oh, you went to residential school. And she would respond, no, I didn't go to residential school. I went to a private Anglican school. And today, she doesn't want to talk about this whole issue at all. She doesn't want to hear anything. She doesn't want to say anything about it. The second point I would like to make is that when I was in Inuvik in 1966-67, I met Father Mouche, who was teaching kids right out of the bush to be cross-country skiers, to do cross-country skiing. And I had been a cross-country skier in my hometown of Jasper, and my coach was Willie Feaster, and Father Mouche had skied for France, and they had competed against each other. So I asked Father Mouche if I could get my skis to stand up and then to ski with the kids. He said, yeah, sure. And if you got any kids over at the Anglican hostel who would like to learn how to ski and would like to participate, send them over and I will equip them and we can train them to be skiers. In the 1972 Olympics, 6 years later, 7 of the 8 members of the Canadian Olympic team in cross country were from that club. 7 of the 8 members in 1972. These are kids, like the first kids who come right out of the bush, you know, ended up representing Canada in the Olympics in 1972. Now, that story, why is it that story well known across their country? It is an unbelievable positive story in terms of the effects of residential school on children and what they actually learn. Why doesn't somebody go and talk to Shirley first and ask her and Jeanette Ferrangeau and the other kids that were members of this team and went around Canada winning you know, gold medals in races in Southern Canada and going to Europe and beating Europeans in cross-country ski because Father Mouche decided that they decided that they were going to learn how to cross-country ski. He provided the resources for that. Hardly anybody knows that story. It's incredible. So 2 good stories doesn't actually destroy the argument, but I think we should take those good stories into consideration as well.
Robert, you're in charge of the sequence. Remember, not me at this point.
Okay, I just don't want to move people along too quickly. Or on the other hand, I'm not sure if I should let people go so slow. The next question is from Brooks.
Rob, I asked you if I might quickly reply.
I'm wondering if we can move along because we have a lot of questions. So I don't want to be rude to people, but we're sort of, we'll run out of time before we run out of questions. So
okay.
Would Brooks be able to ask now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, just a simple sort of political question. Johnny MacDonald's administration gets a great deal of the blame in the press and, you know, throughout the country, the cancellation of high schools named in his name all over this issue. Didn't this issue transcend a lot of administrations and in fact wasn't solved even right up to the point of Pierre Elliott's administration?
I could say something about that's true. If you look at the oldest school that was included in the agreement, it's the Mohawk Institute, and it was established in 1831 in Brantford, Ontario, when John A. Macdonald was a 14-year-old kid in school in Kingston. So how could he, you know, have started these things at such a young age? I know he was very prodigious, but that's a little bit stretching it. So they blame whoever they can to get the effect that I think Francis is pointing at, to get the greatest amount of sympathy and the greatest amount of money out of the rest of the population. And one more point related to that. People probably don't know this, but there's a residential school down the street from us in Winnipeg. It's run by the Southeast Council, and it's a residential school where it's a beautiful school in which Indigenous kids from those reserves come into the city and live in a residence. They're all administered and supervised by Aboriginal people, but people also don't realize that there were many Aboriginal people working in the residential schools from the very beginning. In the 2 schools that I was in, about 50% of the people that worked there were Aboriginals.
Thanks, Rob.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question from Bob Seaman. He put it on the chat unless he wants to say it now. I can read it for us. I can get it up to 303. Okay. Anyways, I can ask Bob's question unless he wanted to come back on. Is there anything to the hysteria at all other than not paying for the transfer home of a body? So I'm not sure if that was clear, but if one of you wanted to say that or answer to that, I'll put it in the chat as well.
Well, I'll take a crack at it if nobody's jumping in. I would say that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission dealt with these issues, and the report alone from Scott Hamilton it's a 45-page report, and it has a lot of detail, and I think that there's certainly many reasons to blame the federal government in particular, but also you can take the Catholics and the Protestants to task over things that should have been done differently. We can all do that. It's pretty easy, and most of it comes down to, well, they should have spent more money. Well, I guess they should have, but we have to remember the times again, just as we have to remember the fact that children died in those times regularly from infectious diseases. We have to remember what the historical times when when the federal government took over the residential schools, the country was almost broke. I mean, talking about John A. Macdonald, like he was trying to scrape together money to keep the government operating, and the CPR bill built at the same time. So it's easy to criticize these people for not spending very much money, but we have to remember the times. It's just a personal anecdote, if you don't mind. It'll just take a minute, but my parents were both teachers in one-room schools during the Depression years, and my mother remembers getting a salary of $40 a month, teaching at a school that had a yearly budget of $50 per year for the school. So when we criticize what the government should have done and what the religious leaders of the time should have done, we have to remember that it was a much poorer time. I'm not apologizing for them, because it seems that they were incredibly, they did lots of things wrong, and they were really way too cheap. But I think that the TRC did deal with this, in billions of dollars have now gone for compensation and to pay for all sorts of programs. They've been very generous with the money that they're devoting to the burial sites. So what I would say is there has to come a time when an issue is laid to rest. When a historical wrong is corrected, there has to come a time when the country sort of moves on. And that's what Canadians have to decide. Are we going to go in for another round, another 30-year round? Because that's what it's been since the Phil Fontaine interview with Barbara Frum in, I think it's 1991. Do we want to go for another 31 years on residential school angst? Or should we try to have really candid discussions about the real issues and try to then and move on from there? Because I don't think we're doing anything ourselves a favor by continuously calling ourselves racists and shooting ourselves. So that's what I'll say.
Yes, can I just say something, Robert?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I just to follow up on Brian's point, I think we have to keep in mind the lawyers and the Aboriginal industry when we think about these things as well. There's terrible suffering in Indigenous communities. No one denies that. But what we are having happen, and this has been going on, I guess, since the 70s, is this discontent which exists is being funneled into these legal types of processes. That's the strategy of the industry. And what happens is all this money gets diverted from what it should really be devoted to, which is improving the conditions, improving these terrible conditions which exist in Indigenous communities. And that's what is kind of the most, sort of disturbing thing about everything that's going on, is that, yes, I think that they're, like, certainly the historical situation was terrible in many ways. And I would argue neglect and insensitivity, just like, sort of cultural kind of superiority, or, attitudes of cultural superiority, which was just, we know what's best and we're just going to impose that, and the kind of terrible toll that does take on societies. But like now, this is just, there is a lot of just people stirring up things to get these legal processes jump-started over and over and over again. And it's not just the residential schools, it's the 60s scoop, and then the murdered and missing Indigenous women, all these things, and as Brian is saying, another round for the next 30 years. Meanwhile, all the terrible conditions that exist in Indigenous communities will keep on going. And digging up a whole bunch of bodies and doing forensics and all the kinds of things, and having another national inquiry into these, similar to the TRC and the murdered and missing Indigenous women, that's going to divert all the attention and the funding from what needs to happen, which is basically healthcare, education, housing, drinking water, all these kinds of issues, which are, which need to be addressed, and it'll be just a big distraction from doing that.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from Elizabeth Weiss.
My question is, do you know if there's, is there any attempt going to be made to determine any of the causes of death, not necessarily by exhuming the bodies, but they can test soils for tuberculosis, for smallpox, and so forth. It's not a perfect system, but they can do DNA tests on soils that would reveal if there was higher levels of those infectious diseases in those soils that's close to the burials. And the other thing is that now with mobile X-ray machines and so forth, you could imagine that even if those bodies weren't removed, that some of them, maybe a small sample of them would be uncovered, let's say, and X-rays could reveal things like Harris lines that would show whether these children had perhaps periods of extreme stress. It doesn't show what caused that stress, but for other things might be like evidence of abuse. So if they had broken bones, that would be, even if they healed, that would most likely be seen in X-rays. And although this might distract from solving problems that are in current populations in Canada and in the US and the Indigenous populations, I think that if evidence, I think that it goes back to the concept of truth, and that if we're trying to figure out what really happened and then trying to tell a narrative that will then shape the future, that some of these things would be useful to do. And obviously I see a comment as well, making the assumption that these are children. That would be, if you take an X-ray of a bone, you could tell right away whether it's a child or not. So some of those things I think would be useful in determining, was there even neglect or was it not? And one of the things that came to my mind as I was hearing about some of these things is the death rates. I have no doubt that they were higher than home death rates, just from the fact that if there was an infectious disease, it would sweep through the school quickly, just like COVID swept through nursing homes quickly. Right? Doesn't mean it's genocide, but I would suspect that neglect plays a large part in the nursing home deaths, the elder care deaths. And so it might be a way to kind of come to an understanding of how much of it was just bad luck, the times, normal deaths, and neglect.
Can I respond just quickly to
Sure.
this? The first thing is there's a whole bunch of records that haven't been assessed, and if you look closely at the Kamloops situation, they made their claims before they assessed any of the records from the school, which are in the archives in Vancouver, and they are open to these people to consult. So the schools had records, and sometimes schools burned down so that records were destroyed. But the churches would also have records, and the federal government would also have records. Some 10 or 15 years ago, the federal government, Indian Affairs, what used to be called Indian Affairs, a lawyer from Indian Affairs came to me because they wanted my records of all the names of the kids that were in Grolier Hall and Stringer Hall, because some kids had been adopted by other parents, and they may have the same disc number or the same band number, and they wanted to figure out how long these kids were actually in residential school. So that's one thing that should be done, I think, before exhuming any bodies, is to actually look at the records that are existing on these grave sites. The second thing that I think could be done much more carefully, and that is if you look at the 150 photographs of kids that are in the actual TRC Commission report, and you would think that the commissioners, given their biases, would actually pick the worst pictures. You will not see any abused or malnourished children in those photographs. You don't see fat kids, but you don't see really skinny, malnourished kids like we saw coming out of some of the displaced persons camp at the end of the Second World War. So if they just picked a natural selection or a random selection of photographs, maybe that would be we would get a better indication of malnutrition and other kinds of problems. But I think that if they would have picked the pictures, they would have picked the worst pictures, and the worst pictures aren't that bad for kids at that time. Seems strange.
Hello, thank you very much. Our next question is for Rod Clifton, and it comes from Ron Thompson. So if Ron wanted to ask his question.
Hi, Rod. I'm just curious if you know what actual Indigenous people in Siksika or elsewhere are talking about these days. How much of the narrative that we hear being dominated by white people is really part of their discourse and what they're saying about these graves that have been found?
Very quickly on that one, my wife talks to her sisters every week, and she was talking to one of her sisters, and she said that I had edited this book with Brian and Francis and a few other people, and the immediate response was, I suppose he took the white position on this issue. So no question about where truth is, but there's a white position on issues which is wrong, and there's an Indigenous position on these issues which is correct. They are talking about it all the time, and it's what Brian says, it's actually stirring up a lot of dissension on the basis of misinformation about what has actually happened, and they're reinterpreting their own experiences, and they have to, because everybody else has reinterpreted their experiences. And if you haven't had a bad experience, then you won't fit in. And if you don't fit in, terrible things can happen to you on the reserve. So I'm afraid that it's polarizing our country.
I'll just add just a little bit to that, because I know nothing about it, but the obvious conflict within the Indigenous community between the church in this case, the Catholic Church and the people who do not wish the Catholic Church well. And I'm guessing that the Protestant people are trying to keep their heads down, hoping that this isn't going to come for them. But I'm quite sure that it is going to. There's something that is really going on there. And of course, religion, I think to some of the Indigenous more extreme advocates, is the ultimate in colonialism, and religion must go. So there's some type of a battle here, within the bigger battle that I don't think we know a great deal about. At least I don't.
Thank you very much. Our next question comes from Matthew Neufeld.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to make a very quick comment as a historian of what's called early modern Britain, so 1500 to 1800. And I'll just say that England and the rest of the British Isles had a civil war, a very nasty civil war in the 1660s. And one of the ways that it was dealt with officially, one of the ways that they undertook a process of reconciliation was to pass something that was called the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion, which was a sort of public agreement that the previous 20 years of turmoil would not be talked about. And in a sense, this was also a recapitulation of how the French Civil War came to an end, similarly with the Edict of Nantes in 1598, where the king, though many converted Henry IV, Protestant Catholic, Catholic Protestant, and finally Catholic, also issued an edict saying, in a sense, that in order for the society to move on from a very nasty civil war, that there would be a kind of official forgetting. So that's an early modern approach to reconciliation. I'm not saying that it's necessarily the right one for Canadians and for Indigenous peoples, but I do think that that there is an element, at least in traditional or practical wisdom, that suggests that after a certain period of time, stirring up things from the past that are painful is more damaging than productive, and it can sometimes be a recipe for future conflict.
Well, I'll comment on that just indirectly, just saying we are watching what's happening to the south of us playing out, and there are, for instance, discussions about reparations for slavery, etc. I noticed that our new Grand Chief, who just was elected, is now calling for reparations in Canada. And in many ways, the discussion over residential schools is very close to what's being the discussion in the United States about past wrongs and how to address these past wrongs. And I think even our leaders are importing a lot of the discussion about systemic racism and that type of thing. So we do have a version, I believe, of the sort of the critical race theory discussion here in Canada already. And I think we're going to be watching it develop, watching it play out over the next couple of years. That's just a guess.
Thank you very much. So Douglas Farrell will be next person with the question.
Thank you. I just want to say that I, today in my article at First Things, I did in the final line include the word reparations, and you've made me think twice about it today. But I do think we have to take into account at least two things in all of this. One is that when the state, for reasons good or bad, takes charge of the lives and education of children, it does have a fiduciary responsibility And if it's broke, it shouldn't take charge. It should not have put the children in harm's way by having schools that were overcrowded and where there was not a proper living condition distinction between the sick and the healthy. And all of that was clear already from Hamilton's report. And I don't think we can hide from that. I don't think we should in any way hide from that. But what is happening around us is not merely a hiding from well-known facts and a strategy to present well-known facts as if they were new and horrific or differently horrific than they actually were. Much more horrific in many respects than they were. But it's also a channeling of public sentiment, even to the point of hatred, even to the point of burning churches and memories, so to say, on Indigenous lands as well as on non-Indigenous lands, which begins to look like a movement towards genocide. Not a dealing with past genocides. I mean, there have been past genocides in this country. What the Mohawks and the Five Nations Confederacy did to the Huron was pretty close to a genocide by anybody's definition. And they don't talk about that. But what are we seeing now? We're seeing lawyers, Indigenous and non-Indigenous and Métis, saying, yeah, burn them down.
Oh, you're still on it?
No problem. We're seeing sentiment channeled in such a way as to cultivate and defend violence against the innocent. By the innocent, I mean, let's just be safe here, Indigenous people who are Catholics or Protestants, their properties, where they married, where they buried their loved ones, where they raised their children, being burned. By whose account are they guilty? And even if they are guilty, why is it vigilante action? And if it's just a few vigilantes, why are people in the legal profession saying, come to me, I'll defend you? We've got a larger problem here. And I don't think we should just talk about the fact that we've been around at several of these problems successfully or unsuccessfully in the past, and let's move on. There's a lot of truth to that, and I've been writing notes and learning things from what various people have said. I'm not actually disagreeing with anybody in particular or with the whole lot of us, but I do think we also have to look in the eye the way in which the pursuit of facts and perspective that is sound and well-based in facts is being set aside, and not just by a few radicals. It's being set aside in the PMO because it's convenient. It's being set aside in the universities because it's convenient to be on the right side, so to say, of this movement that Francis was talking about at the beginning. So we have to address all of that, and that's where the intersection comes between the concerns of the organization that we are part of and the particulars of this issue.
So, okay, so I have a couple of things to say about that. The first is, again, the conceptualization of genocide, which I think, this is important, like in political science, which is my discipline. We spend a lot of time doing this because we're trying to develop the most meaningful way of thinking about a concept. If we are going to define genocide as tribal warfare, then the whole of human history was a history of genocide. So that's, I think, we really, when the reason for and I haven't been able to follow the chat. I know there has been some discussion about this. I find this very interesting because I'm just trying to work on my own definition. I think it's about a state, a state action, which is about intentional extermination. I think that's what is trying to get. So I don't think it would apply, therefore, to the case of the Huron and all these tribal groups who are at war with one another. Reparations. Is there any evidence that reparations lead to reconciliation? I think that is highly unlikely. That's the case. We already had $5 billion paid out in reparations for the residential schools. And it almost seems to make people more angry, because it's almost like saying, and the most disgusting thing I thought was putting dollar figures on abuse. So I'm not sure if anyone's seen this. I'm sure Rod has and Brian, but they had this menu of sexual assault. Like, if you have this kind of sexual assault done to you, you get $50,000, and if you get this, that's outrageous. That's like turning children into prostitutes or something. Like I was just appalled when I saw that. And so I think that's a good question. I don't, like, from what I can tell, the more reparations are paid, the more wounds start to fester, and the thing is that people are looking for closure from the reparations, but I don't think the source of their suffering is not money. Money is not at the source of their suffering. So if you pay people money to alleviate their suffering, you still got the suffering, you pay out the money. And another downside is you start to develop hostility within the wider population, because now it's like, we just paid out $5 billion for the residential schools. As Brian says, why can't we, it's time to move on. Well, we're not going to move on because money's been paid.
Exactly. If I may just interject,
Yeah.
I used the word not in a monetary, but in a penitential, sacramental context, as you'll see if you get around to looking at that.
Yes. But money, I think the paying out money, that's a big mistake. I was always opposed to the payouts. I said, if people are suffering psychologically from whatever the problems that they have, we need to address those problems, and money's not gonna do anything to solve. And that's where we're going again, is that we see this again. The AFN, as Brian said, and I had it in my slides, the first thing she says, reparations, and not just for residential schools in the 60s scoop and everything, for the genocide. So everyone who missed out on the residential schools in the 60s scoop is now going to get payouts just for general genocidal actions that were taken by the Canadian state, which is just going to be an endless kind of cycle.
Stan here, may I say something? Stan here, may I say something?
Yeah, sure. The next question is from someone who actually isn't with us right now. So you can go ahead.
On behalf of the lawyers, being a lawyer, in answer to Francis's book, we have a book in law, and we call it the meat book. It's a crude term. It's Goldsmith on damages. And you go down the tabs and you pick an eye, a leg, a toe, and it tells you what a toe is worth for a construction worker and what a toe is worth for a ballet dancer. So what you were describing is standard legal operating procedure. What's your injury? Here's the scale. Now, I worked at Justice and I wasn't involved in these files, but I know what they're trying to do is simplify things. How do we pay out money without having a discovery for everybody? So we just made a list of injuries, and here are the damages. It sounds very cruel, perhaps even vulgar, but it's Goldsmith on damages. Just want to let you know that's how it works.
I'll add to that if I could. Robert, is that okay?
Sorry.
Can I make a comment about what Stan has said or not?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, and then we'll.
Okay. Yeah, and I agree with that. When they decided to do what they did about damages, basically give everybody who went to residential schools money, no matter what. I think that they made a fundamental error. And when they decided that they would not make people prove their damages in court, I think that was also an error. And it just, with any group of people, it doesn't matter what ethnicity, if you have something that is going to be worth billions of dollars, people are going to jump into the jump in line. If you make them prove their damages in court, you have a lot of protection against false claims, exaggerated claims, etc. So even though we lawyers take a lot of abuse, cross-examination and discovery and that sort of thing are pretty good filtering, a pretty good filtering process. But what happened instead, I suggest, is that people just basically lined up for the money, and people, and I'm not saying many of them were not even Indigenous people. People realized how much money was at stake here, and they've just created a virtual sub-industry, a residential school sub-industry. And there's a lot of people whose jobs depend on this. And they want to keep it going. They want to keep the money flowing. So I think that initial decision not to be very careful about where the money, how the money was spent, and just letting people fill out a form and saying, yes, I was abused, and get a bunch of money. I think that was very wrong. And we're paying the price because people don't want to let it go. As Frances points out in her book, and so does Tom Flanagan, that the Indian industry is an extractive industry. Their money comes from governments, from taxpayers, and the game is to try to leverage the argument so much to keep the money flowing, and the discussion just becomes so extreme that we're now at the point where we have the final solution on the Holocaust and everything. And I don't see it ending anytime soon.
Can I just add one, 2 points? First point, Douglas, your essay is very beautiful in First Things, and I recommend that everybody read his essay in First Things from the last edition was published. And the second thing is, people don't seem to realize that in many Aboriginal communities, there's one-upmanship in telling stories. So in the Blackfoot, there's the teepee stories that are actually published about guys sitting around in the teepees telling stories about the war deeds that they did. They touched the chief's tent, they stole the chief's from an enemy chief, they stole the horses, they raped women, whatever they did. They're telling these things. And the way it's told is that one person will tell the story, and then somebody has to up it and increase the tension. So this is a very common kind of discussion. And I think that probably went on in the formal discussions of the residential school settlement claims, is that people were listening to other people tell their stories, and they say, well, if that happened to you and you had the bed right next to me, guess what happened to me? Let me tell you all the things that happened to me. And then the next person would increase that. And I don't know how you would ever stop that without having cross-examinations as a formal way of going through the one-upmanship in the telling of these kinds of stories. And the highest paid person got almost half, $430,000. That was what the worst abuse person received. So it went from a low of below 49,000 up to $430,000 for just a common experience. The one that Brian was talking about, there was $10,000 for the first year or part of the year that the child was in the school, and then $3,000 for each year or part of the year after that. So it could go from $10,000 up to 37 for 10 years, $37,000 for 10 years in schools. And there was no distinction made upon whether they were in the schools for 10 months without going out, or whether they were in the school for 5 days and then they went home for 2 days and then come back to the school. So it's pretty rough and ready procedures that we used.
Thank you. The next question is from Barbara Kay. I don't know if she wanted to ask it, or I can say it. I don't know. Does she want to come on? Okay. Yeah. So basically, she was just asking about the book by Eric Bays, The Residential Schools, Another Picture, and she found it very good and assumes it was reliable. But she was wondering, the specialists on the panel, if they had any idea if this book was or what they thought about Eric Bays' book.
I don't know.
I don't know either. When was that? Was out recently published, I assume, or at least I'm not aware of it. How do you spell the last name, Robert?
Bays, B-A, like a bay in a lake. Eric Bays. Oh.
Brian, do you know about this book?
I guess if nobody knows what it was, then nobody can give their opinion. Maybe that was homework for the panelists. There was one. Sorry, I have my list here. I don't know. Maybe there was a question from Anna Santacana. Somebody suggested they didn't really know what she was trying to get at, and I don't believe she is on anymore. So I'm not sure if anybody is, if you're interested in, I can send it in the chat again. But I'm not sure if anybody wanted to speak to that, if people can make sense. Otherwise, we don't have any other questions, unless anybody was interested in asking now.
I think Boris had a question, or did he go? He was wanting to speak at some point, and then it was not.
Did he have to leave, or maybe
he left? Anyway, I think maybe if anyone has any more questions, we'd be happy to answer them. I haven't been keeping track of the chat, so I don't know. I'm gonna take a look at it.
I don't think there's a lot of discussion in the chat, but I'm not sure if there's any actual questions remaining. If I missed anyone, please let me know.
Yeah, it's Mark Collard here. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please. I had you on my list, but I wasn't sure if yours was actually a question or just a part of the discussion. So please go ahead.
Yeah. So I mean, I sort of, as you can hear, I'm an immigrant, so I'm still learning about this this situation. But I do know quite a bit about the sort of forensic side of things. I'm an archaeologist and a biological anthropologist, and I'm the undertaking of trying to repatriate something like 6,000 human remains that are, you know, of unknown identity is an absolutely enormous task that requires sort of would require a national level genetic study to be carried out and a national level isotope study to be carried out. And I'm wondering whether there's any of the panelists know whether there's discussion going on about having some sort of centralized effort on that front, whether the government is proposing to take a lead on that. Thanks.
I don't know. I don't know. What I've heard is that the original BC Indigenous group that brought this Kamloops discovery to everybody's attention doesn't want that. that they're not asking. That's my understanding, that they do not want either an RCMP investigation, and they are not asking for a forensic examination. So I hope that's accurate information. I don't have anything up to date on that, but I'm just making the guess that it's not going to get to that
Yes.
to that point.
Yes, and just speculating here, but in Alberta, they're just giving the groups the money. So they're gonna, it's again, sort of a rent-seeking strategy. So you say that you need money to go and, to deal with this and so on. And then it's up to the communities to decide. So I think it's $7 million was just recently announced from the provincial government. So you apply for, and as I understand it, the Kamloops quote unquote discovery was due to grants being given out by the federal government. So the federal government dispersed money to various communities to do, investigations and so on. And then the Kamloops discovery, quote unquote discovery, was part of that. And then now this has led to new sort of demands that monies be dispersed to do more investigation and so on. But the demand has been that it's just the money that should be provided to the communities, and it's up to the communities to decide what they want to do with that money. I think.
Like, I think it seems a bit harsh to call that rent seeking when the money is being directed towards that sort of investigation.
But it's not like the 7 million is not, it's just whatever you would like to do. So you can put it into, like this is what I'm getting. And I'm not trying to, I think that there are legitimate grievances that exist, but this hyping up of things lubricates the machinery in terms of dispersing funds. That's what its purpose is. So what I'm trying to explain is why is this so readily accepted? Like what is sort of the motivation behind all of this, which is genocide, charges of genocide is the most significant crime that a state can perpetrate. And so it provides much more rationalization for dispersal of funds than other kinds of, if we were just to say, as it was the case, it was neglect or it was, all these other things, which are terrible things as well. But it's not got the same kind of punch, leverage that you have with genocide. So if there were no money that were going to be distributed, I don't think that we would see the frenzy. It's almost kind of a frenzied kind of response is, and it's not to say, I totally agree with Brian that, there's been people talking about this, Indigenous people talking about this, and this is truly a matter of concern for them. And in those cases, I think that's a very serious problem, especially if there are cases where parents had children that went off to residential schools and they don't know what happened to their children. That is a terrible, terrible thing, which I think everyone can understand. But I know in my own case at my own university, there's people who aren't even associated with communities talking about the murder of the 215 children. Like that kind of rhetoric. It's like, well, I don't think anyone thinks that 215 children were murdered. That's not rational to be thinking that a bunch of nuns just lined up a bunch of children. This not, it's just highly, kind of hyperbolic kinds of language, I guess.
Can I make a comment, or how do I get my name on the list?
Go, you can, I think you can just now.
Yeah, there's nobody else on the list, so go ahead.
Thank you. I think one thing that I'm noticing a lot is the comments, do you believe us now? Like, poor us, we have suffered all this and you didn't believe us, but now do you believe us? And this plays into the victimhood culture that we see arising. And I'm not saying that the people, the Indigenous people who are discussing it are bad or wrong for doing this, but I can see why they're saying, oh, look at this, look what you did to us, look how big it is. and we're victims. And so there's also that dynamic going on. Do you believe us now like we never believed how tough they had it before?
Well, and again, I think, I don't think, as both Brian and Rod were saying, it's not it was already known. So it was, no one was saying, no, there's no graves there, or no, like, it's just do I believe one of my ex-faculty members who said the 215 murdered children in Kamloops? Well, I don't believe that, because I don't think that makes any sense. There might be an odd child who was murdered. That's possible. I think, but that would be an extraordinary circumstance. So like the belief, basically it is anything that, and this happens in the universities now, to ask questions in universities is seen as harassment. So if someone makes a claim and you're questioning them and you're asking for evidence and so on, harassment. That's generally the response, because the idea is, and again, this goes back to the TRC's kind of different kind of definition of truth, is that truth in the university is generally, we're searching for a common understanding based upon reason, evidence, and logic. That's generally the approach. Whereas the truth for the TRC and various reified postmodernists is, the truth is whatever the oppressed group says it is. Those are two completely different understandings of truth. And we're always going to be talking past one another if we're going to have that second definition that is going to come up.
Francis, can I ask you to clarify something?
Yes.
That you said?
Yes.
So you said that 7 million had been released to the Kamloops band.
Sorry, it was not to the Kamloops. It was recently the United Conservative Party, after all the, sort of what I thought was kind of hysteria, $7 million, an announcement was made that $7 million was going to be made available to communities to do with whatever they chose to do with the $7 million. And it's not, so that would be divided up amongst, I'm not sure how many, but that was generally the situation.
But that was 7 million specifically for investigation into the graves?
No, it was to release this money so that communities could do what they wanted, like, because they didn't want to have that. This is always the kind of the battle that goes on, is the government has money and it usually has it earmarked or targeted to something, and the Indigenous communities say, no, we want to have that, we want to have control over what that money is spent on. So they're going to just make decisions themselves as to how, whatever's in the best interest of their community. But it might not even necessarily be spent on anything to do with the unmarked graves. Could be on counseling or like those, like it's got a wide kind of application. But it's the government essentially saying, we realize everyone's upset. Here's $7 million. And because we don't want to be controlling and paternalistic, communities decide how they're going to use it.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
That's my understanding anyway. I'm just taking that from an announcement that was made by Jason Kenney about it. So I could be, I don't want to just take that as a defense. But again, I sort of saw that and I thought, again, it's linking it up to, accusations that are made. The more serious the accusations, the more kind of emotional, the kind of the tenor, the more easily you're going to be able to get transfers being provided.
I could just add one little small point to that. And the basic talk recently has been about abuse of children in the residential schools. So you would think that in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, there would be thousands of people that had been pinpointed pinpointed as abusing children. But if you go through the whole book, the whole report, 3,500 pages of report, you will not find a list in a table of people that have been abused. Now, there's some people in there that were abusers. Mr. Starr, who worked at the Blackfoot Reserve, abused kids and then moved on to another residential school in Saskatchewan. And if you collect the names of all the people that are have been convicted, charged and convicted of abusing children that are listed in the TRC Commission report, you get about a dozen. That's it, a dozen. That's it. Now, it could be because everybody was covering up for these people, or it could be because there weren't that many. Who knows?
Well, can I add to that just a bit? Because there was a new CBC blurb I read just yesterday on this, where the number of people who have been identified as possible abusers of the children. And I think they offered to have these people come forward and testify, and not surprisingly, not many did. But there were a couple of cases that are going forward where people are actually trying to prosecute the offenders. And the interesting thing is that the offenders are other Indigenous students. And this is not something that is discussed a lot, but we hear about the sexual abuse, which I think was very real within the residential schools. But what we don't hear is that most of this abuse was student on student. In the case I'm thinking of right now, it's a woman who was set upon by 4 other older women, and I think this was the very common type of abuse, and it brings up a very sensitive topic, which is these were mainly probably the kids from the child welfare angle of residential schools. I won't go into that in great detail here, but we also don't hear about the fact that the children who were taken by Indian agents for child welfare reasons, those are the children who had overwhelmingly the most problems in the residential schools. And this should come as no surprise, because the Indigenous child welfare problem didn't begin a few decades ago. It began long ago, and residential schools were used basically from the 40s to the 60s to house, many of the schools were primarily residential child welfare facilities. There were no federal child welfare services, and that's something people don't really understand. Not until the 1960s did Indian people have child welfare services. That's when the provinces came on board and started apprehending children. That's also what's called the 60 scoop, and that's a topic for another day, I'm sure. But what I'm saying here is it's a very complicated discussion of the sexual abuse, and some of the reasons why Indigenous people who went to these schools are so troubled have more to do with what happened in their home communities even before they got to the residential schools. And this is something that is just not discussed by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission at all. And it's something that really has to be looked at. It's a very important part of the discussion.
Thank you very much. I think we'll bring the question period to an end now. I don't know if Paul or Francis wanted to say a final word. Otherwise, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to thank everyone. I'm a board member with the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, and we're trying to have events that are like this, which have to do with difficulties in universities in being able to discuss topics openly. So once again, I wanted to stress that, SAVS doesn't have a position on the residential schools. This is not its mandate at all, but we just felt that it was an area that was difficult to discuss, and therefore we felt that it would be a good thing to sort of raise some of the more general issues about why, you know, why subjects like this are so difficult, because really this is an area where we should be able to have open discussion on, because unless we have open discussion, we're not really going to be able to develop, you know, appropriate mechanisms to be able to address all the suffering that's obviously, you know, existing in Indigenous communities. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and hopefully we'll be having another event soon on another kind of issue that where, you know, discussions are difficult or academic freedom is in jeopardy, those kinds of questions, open inquiry. Thank you very much.